Okay, so this little demo is going to show us how to build the start of a first-person shooter. So we'll build a little scene, throw in our guy, put in a gun, and shoot some targets. So that's the idea behind what we're doing here. So we will create a new project, and I'll call this thing Shooter 3D Shooter. I'll bring in a character controller, skyboxes, standard assets, and terrain because we just want to make something nice for us to run around in and shoot. So I think that should be all that we need. And as we import all of these assets, we'll hopefully end up with a nice scene. And I'm going to go a little bit quickly through the beginning stuff because we've done it before. So if any of this is going too fast, there's other videos that show you how to do this a little bit more step by step. But we are going to create some terrain, and we'll give ourselves some light. And with the terrain, we are going to paint it, and we need to add a texture. We'll add a texture, which was over in standard assets, terrain assets, textures. I'm about to start with some grass, like that. Now we have a nice grass little plane here for our guy to run around in. I'm going to also paint some mountains, so we'll use this raise lower, just so that we can have a nice area that's kind of sectioned off from the rest of this world. Probably it's not a bad idea to make this terrain a little bit smaller, but that's alright. For this little demo, it's not going to matter. I mean, this is our big world. We're going to be just working in this little area here. I'm going to paint these mountains a slightly different color, just because they look nice. Don't really need to be doing this, but I'm going to because I just like it when things look a little bit different. And I'm painting our mountains here, this nice cliff, and yeah, I'm not really coloring within the lines, but that's okay. We get the idea. And then I'm going to smooth this stuff out, and it should be pretty good for what we're doing. All right, then let's see. I'm going to drag in my first-person controller, and zoom in a little bit. Because by default, this thing is halfway sticking in the ground. So we're going to raise it up so we can come out of here. I'm going to delete my other camera. And then on this first-person controller, I'm going to add skybox just because I like the way that that looks a little bit better. I don't know, something like this. And with that, we've got our little scene built. And it looks nice, and we can run around in it. Very good. So the first thing that we're going to do is add a gun to this guy. And there's a few different ways we can do it, but basically if the gun, we already have this first-person controller, this thing here. That's going to move us around, move our guy around. And if we associated our weapon with this first-person controller, then we don't really have to worry about trying to position it and handle keyboard input and make sure it's always in the same spot. We're just going to attach it to our existing first-person controller. And that way, when the first-person controller moves, the weapon is going to move as well. So let's go to the asset store, find a gun, and we'll just kind of drill down here in 3D models. It's under props, weapons, guns, and I'm going to use this modern weapons pack here. Probably could use just about anything you want, but I'm just going to use this one. Import it. The one thing I like about this one is it has both a gun and a grenade. That way we'll use the grenade as kind of a bullet in a second. Let's see, did that finish? There we go. Alright, modern weapons. So this AK-47 is pretty nice. It looks like a good gun. And I'm just going to drag it. I'll just make it part of, you can stick it part of this main camera. And if you notice in our game view, it looks kind of weird because it's right at the top. Let's zoom in on this a little bit in our scene view. See what's happening. There we go. There's our gun. And so it's kind of like right in the middle of the camera. And these coordinates over here are all related to its parent. And so if I can move it just by dragging the X, I can make it go that way. And by dragging the Y, I can bring it down to something that looks a little bit better. It's still cutting things off here, but if we go back to camera and change our clipping plane here, by just dragging this near, I'm changing this near value here, then it looks pretty good. And if we run, hopefully it'll stay in that spot. And see, it moves with our character no matter where we go because it's a child of that character. And that actually looks good. Probably what we need to do, though, is make it shoot something. So this is a really easy way to give your game a good look like it's doing something. Alright, so we want to make this thing shoot. I am going to, here's our AK-47, I'm going to create a script. And I am just going to call it gun controller. Because this is what we want to have control when we shoot. And I'm drag it over there, and now I can edit it. So inside of our gun controller, really the only thing that this needs to do right now is it needs to detect when somebody's clicking the mouse button, and when it does, it needs to fire a bullet. That's sort of the idea. And so to do that, we're going to modify this update method. It's not going to be very complex at all. But we'll say if input dot get mouse button down 0, which is our left mouse button, then we will fire a bullet. And I will make a new method. We'll call it void fire bullet. Alright, so what this is doing is this line right here is checking to see if somebody has pressed the mouse button down. And because it's a 0, it's looking for the left. If it was a 1, it'd be right, 2 is the middle button. So the other thing we could say is just get mouse button. We could delete this, which is just asking, is that button pressed or not? But what would happen is this input method gets called 60 times a second. So if somebody was holding the button down, and this is what your code looked like, it would be firing 60 bullets per second. But we only want to get it when the player, clicks the mouse. So we'll put get mouse button down. That means it's only going to fire 1 bullet per mouse button click. If you wanted to fire something on the release of a mouse button, you could use get mouse button up. And to make sure that all this is working, I always put a little print statement in here, so we can say debug.log fire bullet. And these debug.log commands here just allow you to print out some text to the screen. Well, actually, to the debug console. We'll show you that in a second. But anyway, so if this mouse button is down, then fire a bullet. And so this fire bullet, if you're not too familiar with coding, this means call a function called fire bullet, and it doesn't take any parameters. We'll get more into coding a little bit later, but you can, pass things in here if you want to. So just the open and close parentheses means don't pass any parameters to the function, just call it, or method, whatever you want to call it. So here's void fire bullet void means it's not going to return anything. Fire bullet is just what we named it here, and then inside between these two curly braces, this curly brace and this curly brace is where we put the code that will actually fire the bullet. For now, we're just going to say fire bullet, and let's see if it actually works. So when I run, if I'm clicking, you can see down in the lower left-hand corner it says fire bullet, and then also if I click on this console tab, as I'm clicking, you will see fire bullet being printed 1,000,000 times, and I can click on this collapse, which is sort of collapses every single printout that's similar. And right now, over on the right, right here it says 30. As I'm clicking, you can see that counter going up, and so that's the number of times that I have clicked the mouse button. So yeah, so that's pretty good. We've got our gun here. We've got some code that can detect when we click the button and knows that it's time to fire a bullet. All we really need to do is put some code in and create some bullets and shoot them off. So that's what we have to do next. We are going to create a bullet, and the easiest thing to do is to also create a piece of source code that goes with the bullet that controls that object. We're going to sort of do that step by step. So inside this Modern Weapons pack is a smoke grenade, and I am just going to drop that into our scene right now. And we're going to make it, let's see, where did that go? It's way over here. I'm going to bring that thing back. So we're going to just do some test code right now to see how we want this thing to work. And so I dragged the smoke grenade into my scene, came out of this FBX folder. I'm going to click back on assets. And let's see, where is that thing at? Is it in our view at all? There it is. So here's this grenade. And I'm going to raise it up just slightly. And here it is, hovering off the ground. Because by default, this object is just a model. It doesn't really know what to do. And so we need to give it some physics properties, because when we shoot this thing off, we don't really want to have to worry about calculating the arc of the bullet or any of that sort of stuff. We want the physics engine to take care of that for us. So we need to give this thing some properties and then let the physics engine do the rest of the work. So with the smoke grenade selected over here on the left, I'm going to add a component, physics, rigid body, which is going to allow gravity to pull it down. And I'm going to add one more thing, add component, physics, capsule collider. And what that capsule collider does is that tells the physics engine where it needs to be colliding with other things. What are the bounds of that collision? And that's what's going to happen now if we run. Let's see, where did it go? There it is. Now it should be on the ground. Because the rigid body gave it weight, so it fell. And the capsule collider gave it a box so that the ground knows when it collides with this object. Alright, so there is our little grenade. We need to give that thing some motion. And so what I'm going to do right now may not make a whole lot of sense, but we're going to create a C# script, and we will call it, I don't know, bullet controller. And I will attach that to our grenade. Let's edit that. So now anytime you instantiate this grenade or bullet, this bullet controller code is going to start running. And the very first thing it does is hit the start method. And so I'm going to do something right now. I'll say rigid body dot add force. I'll say new vector 3 0 100 100. So what is this going to do? As soon as this bullet gets created, which in this case, since it's in our scene, it's as soon as the scene runs, it's going to add force to the rigid body in 0 force in the X, 100 force in the Y, and 100 force in the Z. So X is left and right, Y is up and down, Z is forwards and backwards. So when I save this and we go back and run it, what should happen is our little grenade should start rolling because we've given it a force in this direction. So let's see if that happens. There it goes. And it's rolling. So that's pretty cool. Unfortunately, it's not going when we click the button, though. and that we are going to fix right now. So because it's in the start method, it's just going to keep rolling as soon as it starts. And we have nothing telling our scripts that says when you click the start button, or click the mouse button to create this smoke grenade. We need to fix that later. So I'm going to rename this thing. Up here, I'm just going to call it bullet. And I am also going to drag it down into my assets, which is going to create a prefab. And the prefab, this thing down here, is what we're actually going to create later on when somebody clicks the mouse button. Because we don't want to start with a whole bunch of bullets shooting around in our scene as soon as we get in there. We only want to create them when we hit the mouse button. So that's how we save this prefab. And the prefab contains, I've got it selected over here on the right, it's got a rigid body, it's also got the capsule collider, and it's also got the script already attached to it. I'm even going to delete it out of our scene here. So there's a difference between this prefab, which has all of our collider information, and the one that's over here. This thing is just the actual model itself. And so the difference is, even though their images look sort of the same between that one and this one, the difference is this is a prefab that has our script and our collider and our rigid body attached to it. And that's what we actually want to shoot out, is this thing. All right, so in our gun controller, we need to know about bullets. So I'm going to say public game object bullet. And what's pretty cool about that, so as soon as I did this public game object bullet, that means inside of our Unity GUI, we will expose this bullet variable and we'll be allowed to assign something to it. So if I go back and here is the script was on our AK-47. Now all of a sudden this bullet shows up over here on the right, and we can assign an object to that. And I'm going to assign our bullet object by just dragging it from your assets window over into your inspector of your gun controller script. So I just start dragging this thing over and dump it there, and now our gun controller script knows about that bullet and can use it. So go back to our gun controller script. So instead of, when we hit this fire bullet, right now we're just printing out fire bullet. We've already done all of our logic right here for getting the mouse button down and calling our method. Instead of just printing out that we want to fire a bullet, we should actually fire a bullet. So the way we're going to do that is we need to create a new bullet object that will get added to our scene. Because remember, the only stuff we really see in our scene is the stuff that's over here on the left. And right now there isn't anything in there, so we need to, in our code, when somebody hits the button, we want to add stuff over here on the left so that we can actually see it and interact with it. And the way we do that is through something called instantiate. So we're going to instantiate a bullet, and we need to say, where do we want to instantiate this? Remember, this gun controller script is attached to our gun, so I'm going to say, let's just attach it to where we're at. So transform dot position. This is the position of the gun. That's where we're going to create the bullet. And then also wants to know about rotation. So rotations are represented in quaternions, and we don't want to be rotated at all, so I'm just going to say quaternion dot identity. That means don't rotate. All right, so every time we click the mouse button, we're going to call fire bullet, which is going to instantiate a bullet at our gun's position with no rotation. So let's see what happens when we run. Oh, errors. Oh, identity. There we go. All right, so let's see. Here's our guy. I click the button, and we created a bullet. Now, it doesn't look right. In fact, it's not even going where we're aiming, really, half the time. It's just sort of going around. And we're creating all these bullets. Now, there's a few things that's happening. We've got all these bullets out here. They're not really going where we're aiming. They're not coming from the right spot. Like, it's basically not ejecting from the end of the gun like a real bullet would. So we need to fix that, and we'll fix that at some point. The other thing is that these bullets are never really disappearing. They're sort of useless and rolling really slow. And over here on the right, look at all these bullet clones. Every time we click the button, the mouse button, it's going to create a new bullet clone. And if you have thousands and thousands and thousands of these things, like we're going to end up with, every time somebody clicks the button staying in your scene, your game's going to slow down, because even if you run really far away from these bullets, if they're over here on the left, that means the physics engine and the rendering engine, everybody's still doing calculations on that thing 60 times a second. So we're going to clean this up right now, so that, let's just say after 5 seconds, we delete our bullet from the scene. That way, we won't have too many things over here. And we will do that in code inside of our bullet controller. Essentially, all we need to do is after 5 seconds, we will destroy the object. Now remember, this bullet controller is a piece of code that's attached to every single bullet. So every bullet has its own copy of this, essentially. Which is why we can do something like this. We can say, start coroutine, delete bullet. And what this means is we're going to start a function that's going to sort of just hang out in the background until it's time to do something. And so we'll define it. Usually we define things with void, meaning there's no return type. But for something to run in the background, we define it as IEnumerator. And we'll call it delete bullet. Basically, whatever we call it here. And so inside of this thing, what we want to do is wait for 5 seconds and then delete the object. So, and the way you do that is yield, return, new, wait for seconds, and we will say 5.0. So basically that means that this thing is going to happen in the background since it's an IEnumerator. We're going to camp on this line for 5 seconds, and then when we're finished, we want to delete whatever bullet we're attached to. So we can say destroy object, game object. All right. This is just a little cleanup thing. That way we don't have too many bullets, cluttering up our scene. And you don't always have to delete them after 5 seconds. You can delete them when they crash into something. You can delete them after 10 seconds. You can delete them when their velocity is 0. There's all sorts of things you can do. We're just going to delete it after 5 seconds, and let's see if that actually does anything. So I shoot a whole bunch of bullets. Here they are. And we should wait 5 seconds, and now they all get deleted. So as I shoot, there's all these guys on the ground. They're starting to get deleted. There they all go. And now everything is all very clean over on this side. So that's just sort of a housekeeping thing that you need to be concerned with when you're using Instantiate, because it's going to create a lot of garbage in your scene if you're not careful with it. Alright, so let's see. What do we have here? In our gun, when we say fire bullet, we instantiate a bullet, and the bullet, in its start method, has this add force business, which is telling it the direction to shoot it. And it's not always going to be in this direction. These are just numbers that I made up. The direction is going to be based on how your gun is pointing, right? It could be pointed in the ground, up in the sky, north, south, east, west, whatever way you're facing. And so we don't necessarily always want to do this new vector 3, 0, 100, or 100 business, because that's a very specific direction that the player may not be facing. So we want to use whatever direction the player is facing and launch the bullet that way. So I am going to make a new method in here, public void fire. And this is going to actually shoot our bullet. For now, I'm going to take this thing out and just move it down here. So I didn't really do much of anything. I made a new method called fire, and then we add force in this direction. Now, this direction we're going to change. Gosh. But right now I'm going to leave it hard-coded. Eventually we're going to plug in what direction the player is facing. So, but for now I'm just going to leave it this way. And what we really want to have happen is when the player clicks the mouse button, we want to be able to call this fire method. We're going to do that from the gun controller, because the gun is really in control of firing. And we create a new bullet here. The new bullet has a bullet controller script attached to it. Somehow we need to be able to now call this fire method. And we need to do that in a certain way here. So I'm going to do it like this. GameObject, geo equals GameObject instantiate. So I casted this instantiation to a GameObject because that's what we're creating. So it's a bullet, which is a GameObject. And I'm going to save it in this geo variable, temporarily geo for GameObject. And that's going to allow us to call this fire method here in a second. So now I'm going to say bullet controller. Oops. I'll say BC equals geo, which is our game object, dot get component, and we want a bullet controller. Okay, so the bullet controller, we're trying to get this script because this script, this bullet controller script, has this fire method that we want to call so that we can add a force to it. And the way we do that is we save a pointer or reference to our game object, which is a bullet, when we instantiate it. That way we can access it. Basically, it's saying, you know, which one of these items in this hierarchy did we just create? We need to keep a reference to it. Then we get the component, which is a bullet controller, the script here. That way we can say something like bc.fire. Because now BC is referring to this particular copy of a script for the bullet we just created. And if we run, it's going to look kind of similar. Actually, it looks very similar, right? Because it is essentially doing the same thing. But the code is structured now in such a way that if, because this code here is attached to our gun, so we know which way that gun is facing. So if somehow, when we call fire, if we could tell it what direction, like passing a parameter, instead of doing the same direction every time, it could follow the direction that the player is facing. And so that's what we're going to add right now. So what we need to do is create, somehow we got to tell this thing here, we don't want to use this new vector 3 anymore. We want to know what direction the gun is facing, so that we can shoot it in that direction. Because this new vector 3 is 0, 100. 100 is telling us what direction to shoot the bullet. So I'm just going to change this to velocity. And the velocity right now is unknown, but it's going to come from when we call this method. Vector 3 velocity. So as long as when we make the call to this fire method, we pass in velocity, then we'll be in good shape. So over here, when we call fire, this is where we have to pass in the velocity. Because we call fire right now with empty parameters. We've changed it to take a velocity as a parameter. So we need to know where to go. Where do we fire this thing? And we're going to do that by transform direction. We'll say vector 3 forward times 100. All right, so our transform is our gun. What direction is it going? And then let's create a velocity of vector 3 going forward from our current direction. All right, so let's see if this works. If everything is working right, we should be, so part of the problem, so it's kind of working a little bit, but the problem is that it's colliding with our character, and we don't want that. So we need to fix that up. And the way I'm going to do that is, we don't necessarily, right now we're instantiating the bullet wherever the gun is. And that's not really where we want it to come out at. We want it to come out at the front of the gun. So I want to figure out where the front of the gun is. And the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to create an empty game object. And I'm going to put it on my gun. And I'm going to set all this to 0. And then I'm going to move it out. And basically I'm trying to get this thing sort of centered on the front of the gun. And since this is a child of the gun, it's always going to be in that spot. And that actually looks like it's okay. I'm going to rename this thing to say end of gun. So now what we want to do inside of our code is, instead of instantiating our bullet at the position of the gun, we want to instantiate our bullet at the position of the end of gun. And so I'm going to make another variable up here and call it public game object end of gun, like this. And what's this going to do? Since we made this public, it should show up in our editor. End of gun, here it is. And here's my end of gun game object, so I'm going to just drag it in there. And remember, we're really only using this end of gun to tell us where the end of our weapon is. So inside of our code, instead of transform.position, I want to say end of gun dot transform.position. And let's see what that does. Now wherever the gun is, that's where our bullet is coming out of. It's going really slow, so let's speed that up. About times 1,000. And we probably should make a variable for that, but that's all right. There we go. Now, no matter where I'm shooting, it's always coming out the end of the gun. It's always going forward, and we're still deleting after 5 seconds. So that's pretty cool. We're actually shooting out the end of our gun. Now, really all we want to do is to add some targets and figure out what happens when we hit them. So I am going to add, we'll make some simple targets. I'll just create like a sphere. No, it's a very small sphere. Let's see what happens here. Sphere. Slider. Position. Oh, the position is way low. I see what's going on here. Let's bring this thing up in the sky. Alright. And do we have it anywhere? Let's see. Whoa, I put that way up high. Okay. Let's bring it down. And let's bring it more in line with where our character is. There we go. So I'm just positioning the sphere so that we can actually see it. There it is. And look, I can hit this thing. So if I shoot on top of it, we're going to go over. And if I hit here, it's going to reflect and that sort of stuff. And that's all because our sphere has a sphere collider on it. I want to just hide this target if we hit it, so I'm going to turn this thing into a trigger, which means, let me show you. So I clicked on trigger. Now when I shoot it, everything should go through it. See, our bullets are going through it like that. So what we want to have happen is when we detect that a bullet's collided with this sphere, we want to just delete the sphere. And let's take a look at what we've got here. Our bullet. That looks good. We have our capsule collider. And, okay, yeah, so we want to detect when those two things collide with each other. So I'm going to just create a script and put it on the sphere. And I'll say, I don't know, target controller. And I'll drag it over. And so inside of this thing, I will do something like void on trigger. And we did this before when we were working with animations and changing animation states. So when there's a trigger enter, we are going to say, let's just destroy ourselves. Destroy object, game object. And this script is attached to our sphere, so it's going to delete the sphere. If we wanted to delete the bullet too, we would reference col.gameObject, because that is the bullet. Let's see if this is going to work. Yeah, there it goes. So we could, in theory, make this thing, I'm going to drag it down here. Now it becomes a prefab. And so I can do Command D and make a bunch of these. Now if I run, we've got a bunch of spheres, all these different targets, and I can hit them. Try to make them all disappear. I can even get closer if I want to. I can shoot up in the air. Yeah, it's easier. And now we've got some targets. Now the cool thing is, though, is that inside of this thing, on trigger enter, I put the code that says destroy game object. But we don't have to destroy the game object inside of here. We can do something else. We can increment a score. We can play an explosion. We can do all sorts of fun stuff. But as long as we get this far, then we can start being fancy with it and putting all sorts of stuff inside this method to do neat things when we collide with our target. So that's a sort of a short intro on a 3D shooter.